The book of Matthew, chapter 14. Matthew 14. So when I was younger, I used to work as a lifeguard, and mostly lifeguarding is pretty boring. You know, you just kind of sit there and you're looking around for a few hours without very many surprises. Though sometimes I imagine if I was lifeguarding on a beach here with one of these whistles, it would be a little bit more lively, you know, kind of corralling the crowds and whatnot. But anyway, for me, there was a few times while lifeguarding where I needed to rescue someone. And on one occasion, I was working at this summer camp, and I was lifeguarding on a lake. It was dark, water, all of that. And there was this one kid who came, and he jumped right in the water, and immediately he just went down. And so, of course, I jumped in, dove down after him, grabbed onto him. He grabbed onto me. I brought him to the surface. And afterward, as you can imagine, he and his father, who was also there as well, were just so grateful to me, right? And they couldn't stop like showering praise upon me for rescuing this kid as he almost died. And so last week we resumed a sermon series in the book of Matthew, a book that's designed to introduce us to the person of Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection. And Matthew shows us many things about Jesus, but today's story highlights how Jesus is our rescuer, okay? How Jesus came to rescue us, how we respond to his coming by reaching out to him and by praising him. So let's look at Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And so Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As we look at this story, we're going to consider first how Jesus comes to rescue us, and then what it means for us to come to Jesus to be rescued, and then finally how to rightly respond to this Jesus who rescues us. And so first, let's consider how Jesus comes to rescue us as we look at verses 22 to 27. Jesus comes to rescue us. As a reminder of where we're at in the story, in the passage that we looked at last week, Jesus had taken a boat across the Sea of Galilee to a remote place to be alone. But then this huge crowd followed him there, and instead of dismissing them, Jesus had compassion. He healed the sick, he taught them, and then at the end of last week's passage, we saw how Jesus did this large-scale miracle, what we often call the feeding of the 5,000, where he multiplied a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish to feed what wasn't only 5,000 people, that was just the men, probably upwards of 15,000 people. In our passage today, verse 22 says, immediately when everyone was done eating, Jesus sent the disciples away on the boat to cross the lake, while at the same time he dismissed the crowds to go home. It was now evening, and so the intention was that everyone would get home before dark. But for Jesus, verse 23 tells us he didn't leave just yet, but rather after everyone went away, he went up on a mountainside alone to pray. And this was probably what Jesus had intended to do by going alone to this remote area in the first place. Now, we don't know anything about what Jesus prayed when he was up there on the mountain. But remember, at this stage in Jesus' life, there had been this growing opposition to Jesus. He had just been rejected in his hometown, and his cousin and forerunner, John the Baptist, had just been killed. And as Christians, we tend to place a lot of emphasis on Jesus' divinity, which is very much displayed in today's passage, as we'll consider in a bit. But in these moments of prayer, we're also reminded of Jesus' humanity. He was a real human with real emotions and a real need to be dependent upon God, his Father. And probably here Jesus was feeling the weight of all of this opposition and wanting to gain strength by entrusting his ministry into God's hands. But as Jesus was praying well into the night, verse 24 brings the scene back to the disciples. It says, "But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, so the wind was against them." Okay, so the Sea of Galilee, it's about 11 kilometers or 7 miles wide in total. And in John's version of the story, he tells us that the disciples were about 5.5 kilometers or 3.5 miles out at this point. So the disciples are right in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. They're far from land. And skilled fishermen, like some of the disciples, they should have been able to cross this lake in a few hours. But that's not what happened. Verse 25 tells us that by the time that Jesus got there, it was the 4th watch of the night, which is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. And so there's a good chance the disciples were out on this lake in this massive storm for probably 8 to 10 hours, stuck out there battling the elements of the storm in the dark. I'm sure at this point they were scared out of their mind, like barely struggling to survive. It's not like they had, cell phones or some kind of radio. Then, they could call in these rescue boats or something like that. They were completely helpless out there. Now, we've had some pretty massive storms lately. Just even 2 nights ago, it was like tons of rain, wind, thunder, lightning, all that. I don't know about you, but woke me up, and when you're kind of like half awake, it's kind of scary, right? I mean, you're hearing these loud noises, you're hearing the wind, maybe a kid comes into your room scared, and that's us like in our beds with walls around us, roof over us. Even then, we get scared. Imagine what it would be like if you were in a boat during that storm, like way out there in the middle of the water. You're not just hearing the storm, but you're in it, and your life is at stake. That's the disciples here. They're helpless. They probably would have died until Jesus shows up. Verse 25, "And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea." In the midst of this massive storm where the disciples were helpless and about to die, Jesus came to them. And he came in a way that the disciples hadn't yet seen. He was walking on the water. Now, sometimes critics of the Bible suggest that nowhere in the Gospels, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, does it ever directly say that Jesus was God. And truth be told, it doesn't say those exact words, but it's really hard to deny in this passage and in many other places we've seen in Matthew that Jesus' divinity is very much implied here by him walking on the water. See, there's actually this repeated theme in all of Scripture about how God controls the raging waters, how he masters the water. Think about the famous stories of him parting the Red Sea in the book of Exodus or the Jordan River in Joshua. You have the Jonah story where, similar to this, Jonah and a group of men are out there in the storm, struggling to survive, helpless, calling out to God to rescue them, and then God caused the storm to cease. And so this event of Jesus walking on the water, it reminds us of God's mastery of the waters, and it suggests to us, like many stories we've seen in Matthew, that Jesus is God. Add on to this that just a few chapters earlier, Matthew 8 tells of a similar story where Jesus and the disciples, remember the story, they're out in the middle of a storm. Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves and calmed the storm. And we're actually going to come back to that story in a little bit because it has some parallels with this story. But the disciples would have had that in their recent memory. And at the same time, in that story, though, Jesus was with them in the boat, whereas in this story, they don't know where Jesus is. He's far away until Jesus came. And at first when the disciples saw this figure walking toward them, they didn't initially think it was Jesus. Verse 26 says, "But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It's a ghost.' And they cried out in fear." I mean, can you imagine the disciples at this point? Like, they're about to die, and then someone starts approaching them, or something they see starts approaching them on the water. Like, it's possible they may have already thought that the storm was there to punish them or something. I mean, that was a common thought in those days. And then this like ghost-like figure shows up. They probably thought he's coming to destroy them. And so the disciples are absolutely terrified. But I love how Jesus responds to this in verse 27. It says, "Immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid.'" Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Now, when the biblical authors present stories, they're very intentional in the way that they tell them. And one of the techniques that they use then to point the reader to the main idea of a passage was to use something called a chiasm. Excuse me. And in a chiasm, the beginning and the end of the passage have similar words or themes to each other. And then the second part of the passage and then the second to last part of the passage have similar words or themes to each other, and then so on. And when they do this, what they want you to look for is what is in the middle of the passage, because what's in the middle of the passage is the main theme that the author wants to highlight. And without going into all the details of this passage is structured like that, with verse 27 right in the middle of it. Which means that Matthew wants to draw particular attention to what Jesus says in verse 27. In the midst of this raging storm where the disciples are on the brink of death and completely terrified, Jesus comes to them and says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Now, on one level, Jesus' words here, they're meant to be a comfort for the disciples. He's saying, "It's me, it's your teacher, it's your friend, Jesus. I'm the one who you've already seen doing all these miracles, so take heart, have courage, don't fear. I'm here now. Everything will be okay." But there's another layer of meaning to Jesus' words. This phrase where Jesus says, "It is I," in the Greek it literally reads, "I am." So he says, "Take heart, I am." And if you're familiar with the Bible, you know this is a key phrase that frequently comes from the lips of God, and it's even at the root of God's personal name, Yahweh, which means He is. And then so there's this theme in the gospel, especially John. Jesus makes these "I am" statements. He says, "I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. Before Abraham was, I am." And so on the waters, there's something about the way Jesus says this that again points the disciples and us to his divinity. Moreover, this phrase, "do not be afraid," is also something that frequently comes from the mouth of God in the Bible. It's actually the most common command given by God in the Bible. Do not be afraid. And so Jesus is clearly suggesting his divinity to the disciples here. But also he's simply saying to them, you don't need to fear anymore because I'm here. In the midst of this great and raging storm where the disciples are completely helpless, God, in the person of Jesus, came to them. And this is really illustrative of the kind of God that we have and the type of person that Jesus is. A God who comes to us in our troubles. God comes to us in our troubles. God sees the storms of life, the trials we face. He knows our sin, he knows our pain, and he knows our helpless state. And he doesn't stay far away at a distance, but he meets us right there, right in the midst of our troubles. Jesus comes to us. You know, when we go through difficulties, we're often tempted to think God is absent. Or like the disciples thought Jesus was a ghost, we may think, maybe God sent this trial my way to punish me or something. And thus, if I have any chance of getting out of this, I better work hard, better try to be a better person, or just maybe hope that God might have mercy if he even cares about me at all. But the reality is that God is with us in our trials the whole time, even if we don't realize it. In our helplessness, God always takes the first step to rescue us. God always takes the first step to rescue us. One of the interesting things about this story is, remember, Jesus is omniscient. And he knew that storm was happening while he was praying, right? I mean, he's up here in the mountain, the rain's beating down and all that, I'm sure. And so surely Jesus knew the whole time that the disciples were struggling out there in that storm. He may have even, seen them or heard their prayers or something as he was praying. But nonetheless, Jesus waited 8 or more hours until the 4th watch of the night to go out to them. And that may seem strange or even cruel, but it's part of what really helped the disciples to see their helplessness, to better understand who Jesus is, and therefore to trust him to rescue them. And the same can be true for us. Like, we don't always know why God allows us to go through difficulties, but what our trials do is they bring us to a place of helplessness, to know we need a rescuer, and then to realize in Jesus, God is actually right here with me, and he's come to rescue me. And so if you're in some kind of trial, some kind of storm, know that Jesus has come to rescue you. He's saying, take heart, I'm here, I'm God, don't be afraid. So this passage shows us how Jesus comes to rescue us from the storms of life. But this passage also points ahead to Jesus' ultimate rescue mission, how Jesus came to the cross to rescue us from our sin and the raging storm of God's judgment. Jesus came to the cross to rescue us from God's judgment. That's the ultimate storm that every human faces. Apart from Christ, we're helpless in our sin, separated from God, and we can't do anything on our own to get ourselves out of the problem. But in his love, Jesus came for us to rescue us by taking God's judgment upon himself for us, securing for us an eternal relationship with the loving God. In our trials and ultimately in our sin, Jesus comes to rescue us. But this passage isn't only about how Jesus comes to rescue us, it also shows us that we must come to Jesus to be rescued. We must come to Jesus to be rescued. And that's where our passage turns next. At this point in the story, like before Jesus calms the storm, something crazy happens. Verse 28, and Peter answered him, he said, Lord, if it's you, command me to come out to you on the water. Now, what are we to make of this? This is a famous story, so if you've been in the church around, you probably, for a while, you probably heard a sermon on this before. Is this a commendable move by Peter, or is this a foolish move by Peter? One way of looking at this passage is to say, this is a classic example of Peter, overconfident, testing Jesus instead of trusting him. And because he ultimately ends up doubting, Peter ends up getting himself into a bigger problem than he was even in the first place. And there probably is an element of truth in that perspective. Peter didn't need to do this for Jesus to rescue him. But another way of looking at this is that this is a bold act of faith by Peter. He had some doubt if this was really Jesus, but he actually did have so much faith in Jesus as a rescuer that he knew that if it was Jesus, Jesus could do anything and could cause even Peter to walk on the water. And I don't think we have to choose between one perspective or the other here. This whole story actually shows a mixture of faith and doubt. But it's important to note that Jesus doesn't rebuke Peter for asking him to come to him. Okay, rather, he meets Peter right where he's at. He sees Peter's doubt, but he also gives Peter this opportunity to exercise his faith in a powerful way. And in verse 29, Jesus says, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Peter says, "If it's you, command me to come to you." And Jesus says, "Come." And miraculously, Peter does. Jesus came to rescue them, but Peter also came to Jesus to be rescued. Imagine for a moment what this must have felt like to be Peter. He's not like 100% sure if it's Jesus at first. And if it wasn't Jesus, that would have been the end for Peter. But though there are shreds of doubt in Peter here at the beginning, like he has enough faith to take the step out of that boat in the midst of this massive storm, and he walked on the water and came to Jesus. I mean, what an amazing moment that must have been. Fear, joy, all mixed together. Like the feeding of the 5,000, Peter's now not just seeing Jesus do a miracle, but he's actually experiencing Jesus doing a miracle in him and through him. And I'm sure in those brief moments, Peter's fears were subsided. He knew they would all be okay, and this would just be the beginning of this life of experiencing Jesus' power. So great, tremendous faith, until verse 30. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Peter was fully confident. He makes a bold request. Jesus granted it. He started walking toward Jesus. He almost gets to him. And then what happened? He took his eyes off of Jesus. All of a sudden, he remembered where he was, like in the middle of this massive storm on the sea. And he sees these waves crashing, and he feels the strong wind. And what started off as faith turned right back into fear and doubt. And he began to sink. One of the things I love about the scriptures is they don't shy back on showing people's faults. I was actually reminded of this in a conversation with someone recently. He was sharing, part of how he came to faith. This is one of the things he really came to appreciate about the Bible, was how different it is, from other religious texts. And that, the Bible, it isn't some book that portrays all these heroes to emulate that are like so far out there that will never be like these people. And then we look at our own lives and realize, like, I'm nothing like this. No, the Bible shows real people. And even the ones with great faith, they all still have faults. And this is actually why we need faith in the first place. Like, if we were perfect, we wouldn't need to trust someone to rescue us. But because we're filled with flaws, we need a rescuer. And so Peter has faith. Peter walks on water. But then he doubts, he falters, and he sinks. But what's most important is what Peter does next. As he's sinking, he cries out, "Lord, save me," which is exactly the right thing to do. In that moment, as he was going under, he remembered exactly who Jesus is, Lord. And he knew that Jesus had the ability to rescue him. He knew he was completely helpless without Jesus, and so he cried out to Jesus to rescue him. And Jesus did. Verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, but Jesus never took his eyes off of Peter. So right when Peter sank and cried out, Jesus reached out, grabbed him, and rescued him. Before they get back into the boat and the rescue mission was complete, Jesus asked Peter a question. He says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, knowing Jesus, this surely wasn't like some kind of angry or mocking statement like, "Your faith is so small. I can't believe you doubted." It's probably not. I'm sure that's not the tone of what Jesus is saying. You have to imagine it was more of a compassionate question. Or Jesus is saying, "Peter, you started off well. You walked on water, for goodness sake. Why then did you doubt?" Like, you knew it was me. There was no reason to doubt. And notice Jesus isn't saying Peter had no faith. It really did take faith for Peter to take those steps toward Jesus. Peter knew his predicament. He believed Jesus was who he says he was. And Peter went to Jesus with his problem. That's all faith. But what Jesus is saying here is that Peter's faith might not be as big as he thinks it is. He has faith, but it's small faith. It's just big enough for him to walk on water, but it's still small. And Jesus is using this moment to grow his faith. But in spite of his little faith, I do think Peter here teaches us a lot about what we're to do in our trials, what it looks like for us to have faith in Jesus in the midst of our storms. As we saw earlier, step 1, in our trials, we believe that Jesus has already come to rescue us. He took the first steps. But we also must come to Jesus to be rescued. We recognize our predicament. Whatever trial we're facing, we recognize our sin. And then in faith, we look to Jesus, fully believing who he is, and we go to him to be rescued, and we walk in obedience. Like, this is a little picture here of what faith is. It's believing who Jesus is, and therefore having confidence in who he is, we go to him to be rescued. It's not just something we believe up here. It starts with something that we believe to be true about Jesus, but it actually involves an action by us to go to Jesus to be rescued, and then responding to Jesus in obedience. It's a little picture of what faith is. And the point of the story isn't that through Jesus, we all can literally walk on water. Of course, God could do that kind of thing again, but actually our steps of faith toward Jesus are going to be related to whatever specific trial that we're going through. For Peter's out there sinking on the water. And so for Peter, the step of faith involves him walking on the water. For you, it's something completely different. But the idea is we believe who Jesus is, we go to him to be rescued, and we walk in obedience. And practically speaking, this could look like a lot of different things. Prayer, maybe obedience to how you know God calls you to live in whatever particular situation you're in. It means doing the things that Jesus does, like Peter's doing in this passage. It means following his voice, following God's word. It means taking risks, saying, like, I don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but it's better to step out of the boat than to stay in it. Better to walk and follow Jesus than to just stay put. And you keep your eyes on Jesus, not wavering. Keep going. And when you fail, and you know it, you resist the urge to beat yourself up about it, but you have faith again. And you cry out, Lord, save me. And you watch Jesus rescuing you. This is a pattern of the Christian life. You have faith, and when you have moments of doubt, you turn back to him again and say, Lord, rescue me again. The point of faith, we mess this up a lot about as Christians. We focus so much on our faith. Faith isn't really about focusing on our faith at all. What's more important is what you're trusting in, like the object of your faith. See, the story isn't about how we need to have perfect faith. It's more of a story about how even with a little faith, you can walk on water. And when you doubt, you cry out to God again. In the end, it's not ultimately about the size of our faith. It's about the person that we're trusting in, Jesus, the God who rescues us. If our faith was perfect, we wouldn't need Jesus. The whole nature of faith is saying, I'm weak, but he is strong. And so I'm going to keep looking to him. It's important for us to realize this because we often beat ourselves up in our failures, and then they inhibit us from moving forward. One of the things that I imagine that most of us in this room watched the AFCON final this week. Wild ending there. One of the things that struck me was, they put Brahim Diaz on the screen. He's in tears, and he's saying, I let this country down. And sure enough, he missed the kick, could have won the game. But for goodness sake, he was the top scorer in the tournament, right? He was a major reason why Morocco even made it to the final in the first place. And while I'm sure he'll never forget the penalty kick, if he can move forward, what happened may even make him a better player in the end. But if he gets stuck in this mode of I'm a failure, and if other people seeing him this way, it may be hard to recover from that. Peter had doubt, and he sunk. But he still took the steps in the first place. And when it mattered most, he cried out to Jesus to save him. And over time, Peter's faith grew. And in a few chapters, we'll see him making this amazing profession of faith, where he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And we all know Peter will doubt again. This famous denying of Jesus 3 times when Jesus is going to be crucified. But when Jesus rose from the dead, Peter came back to Jesus again, and he was restored, and he went on to courageously lead the church and preach the gospel even unto his death. How about you? Think about some of the trials you're facing. Maybe physical trials, emotional trials, relational trials, spiritual trials. What does it look like for you to come to Jesus in the midst of whatever you're going through? What are some steps of faith that you need to take to come to Jesus to be rescued? This is a personal question here that relates to whatever you yourself are going through. You could look at what Peter did, but what about you? Like, what's going on in your life right now? What does it look like for you to step out of that boat and go to Jesus to be rescued? What does that mean? Perhaps there are some areas where you might be doubting Jesus. Or maybe you're thinking like, I had good faith in the past, but now I've really gone in the wrong direction. Confess that to God and cry out, Lord, save me. And know that Jesus will reach out and he'll take hold of you and he'll rescue you as you return to him. I remember a long time ago when I was first going overseas and I was taking this, did this little training course thing, and I remember this little phrase that they taught us. It says, not what you do first, it's what you do next. That you're going to have a lot of failures, make a lot of mistakes. Not what you do first, it's what you do next. Like this idea of keep going. As we said earlier, this passage, it can be applied to any of life's trials. But our biggest predicament is actually our sin. Jesus came to the earth, he came to the cross, he came back from the dead to rescue you from your sin, to reconcile you to God forever. And your part then is to call out to him by faith and say, Lord, save me. Save me from my sin. Save me from God's judgment. And you can be confident that when you cry out to him in faith like that, he will reach into the grave. And he will pull you out, and you'll experience resurrection life here on this earth today, and one day you'll be raised again from the dead to new life. Jesus came to rescue you. Now you come to Jesus to be rescued. And finally, as this passage comes to a close, we see what the only response is, the only appropriate response is when we experience Jesus rescuing us. To worship him forever because he's worthy. Jesus comes to rescue us. We go to Jesus to be rescued him, and we worship Jesus forever. Okay, so right after Jesus pulls Peter up, verse 32 says, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. After this brief interlude of the event with Peter, we're brought back to why Jesus came to them in the first place, to rescue them, to save their lives. He didn't just come to rescue Peter, he came to rescue all of his people. Now, earlier we mentioned that this story has a lot of similarities to when Jesus and the disciples were in the boat and Jesus calmed the storm. And actually, in that story, Jesus posed a very similar question to the disciples as he posed to Peter. Let's go back to Matthew 8:26. This is when they were in a different storm. Jesus was in the boat. Matthew 8:26, and Jesus said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" And he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. But do you remember what the disciples' response was to Jesus in that story? Let's look at it. Next verse, Matthew 8:27. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the waves, or winds and the sea obey him?" So after this first storm that the disciples were in, they're amazed at Jesus. And that may have been their first inclination that Jesus was more than a mere human. They're saying, what sort of man is this? But how do the disciples respond now after Jesus calms the storm? Matthew 14:33, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Through spending time with Jesus, the disciples' faith in Jesus has actually grown. You know, from later statements, we know the disciples don't totally grasp everything about Jesus at this point, but they've seen enough to know he's no mere human. Rather, he's the very Son of God. And so they respond by worshiping him. And this shows us the only appropriate way to respond to this Jesus who rescues us. When we see Jesus for who he really is, the God who's compassionate and powerful enough to heal the masses, multiply food, calm storms, and willingly die and rise from the dead, and when we experience this Jesus rescuing us, the only proper way to respond to him is worship. We bow down before him. We loudly confess him for who he truly is. We yield our lives in full submission to him, and we give him all the glory for who he is and what he's done. You know, this isn't a story about how great Peter is. Like, Peter isn't worthy of our worship because of his faith. You're not worthy of worship for your faith. I'm not worthy of worship for my faith. Our faith is real, but it's small. Jesus is the hero in this story. Jesus alone is worthy of worship for being the God who, in spite of our sin, our weaknesses, and our failures, he comes to rescue us anyway. And so worship Jesus for rescuing you now and forever. Worship Jesus for rescuing you. Today's story has highlighted Jesus as our rescuer. And we've seen how he comes to rescue us, how we must come to him by faith to be rescued, and then as we experience his rescue, how we worship him forever. And friends, Jesus is here with us right now. He's in the midst of whatever you're going through, whatever trial you're going through, whatever storm you're going through, Jesus is here even in your sin. And he's saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And if you believe that, like Peter, then come to Jesus now. Walk on the water now. Say, Lord, I'm weak, but you're strong. I'm helpless. I need you, Lord. Save me. And grab onto Jesus' hand. Jesus is the only Son of God who was sent into the world to rescue us. And as we close, let's respond to this Jesus by calling out to him again, by seeing that he's here in our trials, believing that he's here, hearing his voice saying, do not be afraid, and calling out to him and saying, Lord, save me, and worshiping him, thanking him for who he is and for what he's already done, praising him for what he's doing now, even if we can't see it, and rejoicing in what he will continue to do in our future. Jesus is our rescuer. Amen? Amen. Let's go before the Lord in prayer now. As we've been doing for the last number of weeks, I just want to let's take a time right now for each person in here to go before the Lord on your own, just individually, not following my prayer just yet, but giving your own prayers to God, praying aloud to God or quietly in your own heart to God, laying your trial or whatever it is before him, and walking on the water, placing your faith in Jesus, crying out to him right now. Let's do that for a few minutes, and then we'll come back together, and then I'll close us in prayer together. So spend some time on your own, just praising Jesus, crying out to Jesus, remembering who he is and what he's done. God, we do come before you now as your people gathered together in this one place with individual voices crying out to you and knowing that you see our lives, you see our trials, you see our storms, you see our predicaments. God, we believe that you are here with us. We look at this Jesus, we look at you, and we see you as one who comes to us. He doesn't stay far away, but who meets us. And we hear you saying to us right now, take heart, it is I. I am here. I am God. Don't be afraid. And God, we respond to that by coming to you now. God, I pray for each of us in here, God, that we would take steps of faith, that we would walk on the water. God, we're walking on it right now as we're praying to you right now. We're coming to you right now. God, I pray for anybody in here who might be burdened by the weight of their sin, feeling conviction of it, God, that they would confess that to you, look to the cross, and see you dying and rising for them, and cry out, Lord, save me, placing their faith in you and you rescuing them for all of eternity. God, I pray that. God, I pray for all of us in whatever we're going through. And that we're not looking back on all the failures, mistakes that we've made in the past, but that we're freshly coming to you again right now today and saying, Lord, save me. Lord, help me. Lord, I trust you now. Lord, I'm going to persevere now. I'm looking to you. I'm placing my faith in you. And God, we thank you that you are a God who rescues us. That you died, that you rose again, that your Spirit is here in our midst, and that you continue to work, doing a mighty work as your kingdom advances. And so, God, we cry out to you in worship. And we thank you and we praise you. And we say, Jesus, you are the one and only Son of God. And so we are here in this place, in this land, confessing that, praising you, going before you, and asking you to rescue us again. God, we now turn our voices again to song as we praise you for all who you are and all of what you've done. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.